In the annals of English royal history, few deaths have sparked as much controversy, horror, and fascination as that of King Edward II in the year 1327. What transpired behind the stone walls of Berkeley Castle on that September night remains one of medieval England's most gruesome mysteries. Official records claim natural causes, but whispered tales tell of something far more sinister, a death so cruel and symbolic that it was designed not merely to end a life, but to send a message echoing through the ages. Edward Plantagenet was born to inherit one of Europe's most powerful thrones, yet he died a prisoner in his own kingdom, abandoned by his nobles, betrayed by his wife, and despised by many of his subjects. His reign, marked by military disasters and personal scandals, ended in such utter disgrace that even the manner of his death became a weapon in the hands of his enemies. The story you're about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about medieval justice, royal authority, and the lengths to which people will go to erase a hated legacy. The methods allegedly used to end Edward's life were not chosen at random. They were deliberate, symbolic, and reflective of what their enemies deemed his greatest sins. But to separate historical fact from political propaganda, we must navigate layers of rumor, chronicle, and deliberate misinformation that have obscured the truth for nearly 7 centuries. What emerges is a tale that reveals not only the tragic end of one king, but also medieval attitudes toward power, sexuality, and punishment that remain disturbingly relevant even today. To understand the horror of Edward II's final moments, we must first grasp who he was and the world he grew up in. Born in the year 1284, he was the 4th son of the formidable Edward I, known as Longshanks. The young Edward grew up in the shadow of one of England's most successful warrior kings. His father had conquered Wales, subdued Scotland, and established England as a formidable military power. It was expected that Edward would carry forward this legacy of strength and conquest. But from his earliest years, it was clear he was a man of a different mold. Medieval England, at the dawn of the 14th century, was a society built on rigid hierarchy and uncompromising expectations of royal conduct. Kings were expected to be warriors first, leading armies into battle and expanding territories through conquest. They were to embody piety, devotion to the Christian faith, exemplary marriage, and the ability to secure the continuity of royal authority. Personal relationships, especially those deemed inappropriate or politically inconvenient, were subordinate to the interests of the crown and state. Edward's troubles began almost immediately after his ascension to the throne in the year 1307. Unlike his father, who earned respect through military victories and firm governance, Edward II showed more interest in personal relationships and leisure than in the complex work of ruling. His close friendship with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston became an immediate source of scandal, not only due to its intensity, but because Edward elevated Gaveston to positions that outraged the established nobility. The political system of medieval England rested on a delicate balance between royal authority and the privileges of the nobility. Great barons expected to be consulted in governance, appointed to key posts, and rewarded with royal patronage. When Edward instead showered Gaveston, a foreigner of relatively modest origins, with titles, lands, and influence, he violated this fundamental order. The title of Earl of Cornwall, one of England's most prestigious, was granted to Gaveston, along with vast estates and the king's clear favoritism in all matters. The situation was exacerbated by the nature of Edward's relationship with Gaveston. Medieval chroniclers, writing with varying degrees of hostility toward the king, described their bond in terms that contemporaries found deeply troubling. Whether their relationship was romantic, as many modern historians suggest, or simply an unusually intense friendship, it defied medieval expectations of how a monarch should behave. In an era when royal marriages served diplomatic purposes and personal desires were subordinate to political necessity, Edward's evident devotion to Gaveston struck many as a dangerous weakness that threatened the stability of the realm. The crisis deepened when Edward's military campaigns suffered catastrophic failures. His father had left him with unfinished conflicts in Scotland, where Robert Bruce fought for independence. Instead of swift victories that might have restored faith in his leadership, Edward endured a series of humiliating defeats. The most devastating was the Battle of Bannockburn in the year 1314, where a significantly smaller Scottish force routed the English army, capturing numerous noble prisoners and delivering a blow to England's prestige from which Edward never recovered. Bannockburn was not just a military defeat, it was a catastrophic failure of leadership that exposed Edward's fundamental shortcomings as a warrior king. Medieval warfare depended not only on tactics and numbers, but on the personal presence of the monarch and his ability to inspire. A king who could not lead his troops to victory, who appeared indecisive or weak in the face of enemies, lost not only battles, but also the mystical aura of royal authority. Edward's nobility began to see him not as a divinely appointed ruler, but as an obstacle to England's success and security. The fallout from Bannockburn fueled organized opposition among the barons against Edward's rule. Leading the charge was his cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, alongside a group of powerful barons who imposed increasingly stringent limits on the king's authority. They demanded the right to approve royal appointments, control finances, and effectively reduce Edward to a figurehead. This conflict was not merely about policy disagreements, it struck at the heart of whether Edward II was fit to rule. Tensions escalated further after his marriage to Isabella of France in the year 1308. Initially arranged as a diplomatic union to strengthen ties between England and France, the marriage began with promise. Isabella was intelligent, beautiful, and politically astute, precisely the kind of queen who could stabilize Edward's turbulent reign. She bore him 4 children, including the future Edward III, seemingly fulfilling her primary duty as a royal consort. However, Isabella's position grew increasingly untenable as Edward's relationships with his favorites dominated court life. After Piers Gaveston's execution in the year 1312, ordered by hostile barons, Edward formed an equally close bond with others, particularly Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers, father and son, became even more powerful and despised than Gaveston, effectively ruling England through their influence over the king while amassing vast wealth and lands. For Isabella, watching her husband lavish attention, affection, and resources on his male favorites while neglecting his royal duties and their marriage became unbearable. She was not merely a jealous wife, she was a queen whose political standing and personal dignity were systematically undermined by Edward's behavior. The French court, where she was raised, viewed the situation in England with growing concern and disdain, seeing Edward's reign as a disgrace to royal dignity and an insult to their daughter. Together, Isabella and Mortimer began assembling forces for an invasion, securing the support of disaffected English barons and preparing to overthrow Edward II by force. The queen transformed from a neglected wife into the leader of a revolution against her own husband. The invasion of 1326 was swift and devastating. Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk with a small force, but Edward's regime collapsed almost immediately. Years of resentment over the Despensers and disgust with Edward's rule meant few were willing to fight for the king. One by one, nobles defected to Isabella's side, leaving Edward virtually without support. The dispensers were captured and executed with extreme brutality. Hugh Despenser the Younger was hanged, drawn, and quartered, but not before enduring additional tortures that reflected the rage his rule had provoked. Edward himself fled westward, hoping to reach Wales or Ireland for refuge, but was captured near the Welsh border in November 1326. The man who had once been one of Europe's most powerful monarchs was now a prisoner, entirely at the mercy of those he had alienated through years of inept rule. His capture marked not only the end of his reign, but the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy him, not just as a king, but as a person. The deposition of Edward II was an unprecedented event in English history. Never before had a king been formally removed from the throne during his lifetime. This process required delicate legal and political maneuvering to create even the appearance of legitimacy. Isabella and Mortimer, now ruling in the name of Edward's young son, the future Edward III, had to act cautiously to appear legitimate, while ensuring Edward could no longer threaten their power. A parliament was convened in January 1327, though it was hardly a free assembly. Mortimer's supporters controlled London, and, with Edward in custody, the gathered barons and clergy faced a stark choice: formally depose Edward II or face the consequences of resisting the new regime. The charges against Edward were damning: incompetence, failure to protect the kingdom, ceding authority to favorites, and bringing shame to the crown. While there was truth to these accusations, the process was a show trial designed to provide legal cover for a successful coup. The most innovative aspect of the deposition was the claim that it reflected the will of the entire kingdom. Rather than a mere palace coup, Isabella and Mortimer insisted they acted on behalf of all England, nobility, clergy, and commoners, to remove an unworthy king and replace him with one capable of proper rule. This was a radical constitutional step that had lasting implications for English governance, setting precedents for parliamentary involvement in matters of succession that the nation would revisit in later centuries. Edward's formal abdication was secured through a combination of legal pressure and veiled threats. Envoys were sent to Kenilworth Castle, where he was held, to inform him of Parliament's decision and demand his official relinquishment of the crown. The scene described by chroniclers was pitiful. Clad in plain black clothing, the former king wept as he agreed to relinquish the throne to his son. Whether this abdication was truly voluntary or coerced remains a subject of historical debate, but the practical reality was that Edward had no choice. The new regime faced a fundamental problem: what to do with a deposed king? Simply releasing him was unthinkable. He would always remain a potential rallying point for resistance. Keeping him imprisoned indefinitely was politically risky and costly. Other kingdoms had precedents for dealing with inconvenient ex-rulers, but none fully suited Edward's situation. The decision ultimately made was both subtle and sinister. Edward was transferred from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, ostensibly for reasons of security and economy. Berkeley was owned by Thomas de Berkeley, a baron whose family had suffered under Edward's reign and who could be trusted to ensure the former king remained securely confined. The choice of Berkeley was no accident. It was remote enough to prevent rescue attempts, heavily fortified to preclude escape, and controlled by a man with personal reasons to despise Edward II. The conditions of Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley were deliberately harsh. Gone were the comforts befitting his royal status. Instead, he was held in a cell designed to break his spirit and undermine his health. Psychological pressure was as critical as physical constraints. Edward was to be stripped not only of his crown and freedom, but also of his dignity and hope. Every aspect of his daily life was calculated to remind him of his fall and his complete dependence on his captor's mercy. According to some contemporary accounts, the conditions at Berkeley were engineered to kill Edward slowly, while maintaining plausible deniability of intent to cause death. His cell was allegedly positioned above the castle's drainage channels, exposing him to disease and foul air. Food was scarce and irregular, bedding uncomfortable, and treatment deliberately humiliating. If he succumbed to illness or despair, his captors could claim they were merely following orders without intent to harm. However, this gradual approach to eliminating Edward proved too slow for those in power. By the summer of 1327, political pressures mounted demanding a more definitive resolution to the problem of the deposed king. Rumors circulated of potential rescue attempts, and foreign courts began raising uncomfortable questions about his treatment. Isabella and Mortimer needed Edward's death, but it had to appear natural, or at the very least, not overtly violent. The shift from passive to active measures against Edward's life marked a critical turning point in this grim chapter of English history.
What transpired in Berkeley Castle became one of the most debated and horrifying episodes in medieval chronicles. The story is so brutal and laden with symbolism that many historians have questioned its veracity. Yet, evidence suggests something truly horrific occurred in that prison cell, not merely the elimination of a political rival, but a demonstration of the consequences of defying medieval expectations of royal conduct. The summer of 1327 brought mounting pressure on Isabella and Mortimer to resolve the problem of Edward II. Foreign courts, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, began asking pointed questions about his treatment. Pope John XXII expressed concern for Edward's condition, and rumors of plots to free him from Berkeley Castle persisted. Even more troubling were reports that some English nobles were questioning the legitimacy of the deposition, wondering if they had gone too far in stripping an anointed king of his throne. The political logic was ruthless but clear. An alive Edward II would always pose a threat to the new regime. As long as he drew breath, many still viewed him as the rightful monarch, despite his formal abdication. His son, Edward III, was still a minor, meaning Isabella and Mortimer's power depended entirely on their ability to prevent the deposed king's restoration. They had crossed a line beyond which reconciliation was impossible. They needed to bring the coup to its grim conclusion, no matter how dark. The decision made was a quintessential example of medieval political murder, a blend of plausible deniability and symbolism. Edward could not simply be stabbed or poisoned. Such a death would make him a martyr and risked sparking rebellion among those still loyal to the royal line. His death had to appear natural while simultaneously serving as a warning to others about the consequences of defying medieval expectations of royal conduct. Contemporary chroniclers, writing years or even decades after the events, provide conflicting accounts of what happened at Berkeley Castle in September 1327. Some claim Edward died of natural causes, grief and harsh treatment. Others hint at more sinister circumstances without elaborating. But the most detailed and disturbing accounts describe a death so horrific and symbolic that it seemed designed not only to kill Edward, but to obliterate his reputation and instill fear in his potential supporters. The most widely circulated version of Edward's death describes a method of execution both brutal and deeply symbolic. According to these accounts, the former king was held down by guards, while a red-hot iron rod was inserted into his body through his rectum, burning his internal organs and causing an agonizing death without leaving visible external marks of violence. This method allowed the killers to claim he died naturally, while ensuring a maximally painful and humiliating end to his life.
The symbolic nature of Edward's alleged execution method cannot be overlooked. In medieval thought, punishments often mirrored the nature of the offense, and Edward's supposed homosexual relationships with his favorites shocked his contemporaries. If the accounts are true, his death was designed as an extreme expression of contempt for what his enemies saw as sexual deviance and a failure to embody proper masculine royal authority. The practical execution of such a killing would have required meticulous planning and the involvement of multiple individuals. The iron would need to be heated to the precise temperature, the victim securely restrained, and the act performed with enough precision to achieve its goal while leaving minimal evidence. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous decision. It was a carefully calculated act of political terror intended to demonstrate the consequences of crossing Isabella and Mortimer. Edward's death, announced as occurring on the 21st of September, 1327, was reported to the new government in London with suspicious promptness. The official cause was natural death from grief and illness, and elaborate funeral ceremonies were staged to emphasize the new regime's respect for royal dignity. Edward's body was displayed publicly before burial, reportedly showing no visible signs of violence consistent with the alleged method of murder. Reactions to the news of Edward's death varied sharply depending on political allegiances. Isabella and Mortimer expressed public grief while privately celebrating the elimination of their greatest threat. Supporters of the old regime whispered of possible murder but dared not speak openly. The common people, who had suffered under Edward's rule yet still revered the monarchy, were bewildered and unsettled by the rapid sequence of events: a king deposed, imprisoned, and dead within a year. What makes the story of Edward's death particularly chilling is not only the alleged brutality of the method, but the cold calculation behind it. This was not a crime driven by anger or desperation. It was a political assassination elevated to the level of performance, aimed at destroying not just a man but the very idea of his authority. The symbolism was as critical as the practical outcome. It served as a warning to anyone who might challenge the new order of what awaited them in failure. The immediate actions following Edward's death reveal how meticulously this final act of his tragedy was planned. Within hours of the announcement, messengers were dispatched across England to sheriffs, nobles, and church authorities. The speed and coordination of this communication suggests that the death was anticipated and prepared for, not the sudden natural event the official narrative claimed.
Berkeley Castle itself became a meticulously controlled crime scene. Thomas de Berkeley, the castle's lord, immediately distanced himself from any responsibility for Edward's death, claiming he was absent at the critical moment. This convenient absence was almost certainly prearranged to provide him with plausible deniability while ensuring someone with sufficient authority was present during Edward's final hours. Others in the castle, guards, servants, and officials, were either silenced or eliminated as potential witnesses. The preparation of Edward's body for public display was another critical element of the cover-up. Medieval embalming techniques were rudimentary but sufficient to preserve a body for the weeks needed to organize a royal funeral. Moreover, the embalming process destroyed much of the internal evidence of any alleged torture, making it nearly impossible to challenge the official narrative of death through examination of the remains. The funeral itself was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to showcase Isabella and Mortimer's feigned grief while reinforcing their authority as guardians of royal dignity. Edward's body was transported from Berkeley to Gloucester Cathedral with full ceremony, drawing crowds of onlookers who could confirm the absence of visible signs of violence on the former king's body. The lavish tomb erected in his honor, still standing today, proclaimed him a legitimate monarch who died naturally, not a victim of murder. Perhaps most telling was the fate of those directly involved in Edward's confinement. Within months of his death, several guards and officials at Berkeley Castle died under suspicious circumstances. Some perished in accidents, others vanished without a trace, and still others were found dead in ways that hinted they knew too much about what had truly happened. This systematic elimination of witnesses was the final phase of the cover-up, ensuring that the truth about Edward's death was buried with those who had seen it. The broader political consequences of Edward's death unfolded exactly as Isabella and Mortimer had planned. With the former king's elimination, resistance to the new regime collapsed. The young Edward III was crowned with due solemnity, but real power remained in the hands of his mother and her lover. For several years, their rule seemed secure,
justified by the removal of an incompetent monarch and the establishment of what appeared to be a more effective government. The very cruelty that made Edward II's murder politically effective also sowed the seeds for Isabella and Mortimer's downfall. Whispers of what truly happened at Berkeley Castle created an atmosphere of revulsion and fear, gradually eroding their authority. Many who had supported Edward's deposition began to wonder if they had unleashed forces too dark and dangerous to control. The line between necessary political action and unforgivable cruelty had been crossed, and the moral legitimacy of the new regime was forever undermined. The international reaction to Edward's death was more muted than might be expected, partly because most foreign courts were relieved by the resolution of England's political crisis, and partly because the official narrative of a natural death was difficult to challenge without concrete evidence. However, private correspondence between royal courts reveals significant suspicion about the true circumstances of Edward's demise, and this distrust shaped England's diplomatic relations for years. The most significant consequence was the lesson absorbed by the young Edward III, whose father's fate shaped his own approach to kingship. As he matured and consolidated his power, he displayed none of the weakness or indecision that characterized Edward II. His overthrow of Isabella and Mortimer in 1330 was swift and decisive, reflecting lessons learned from both his father's mistakes and the methods used to destroy him. The cruelty that eliminated Edward II ultimately created the conditions for its own retribution. The question of whether Edward II was truly killed in the horrific manner described by some chroniclers has been debated for centuries. The evidence is contradictory and politically charged, making definitive conclusions elusive. What can be said with certainty is that powerful figures wanted Edward dead, that he died under suspicious circumstances in their custody, and that the official explanations were designed more to protect the guilty than to reveal the truth. Some modern historians argue that the story of Edward's gruesome murder was a later fabrication, crafted to tarnish Isabella and Mortimer's reputation after their fall. According to this theory, Edward may have died naturally or been killed by more conventional means, with the horrifying details added by chroniclers seeking to underscore the villainy of the usurpers. The symbolic nature of the alleged execution method so precisely aligned with medieval anxieties about Edward's sexual transgressions does seem almost too perfect to be historical fact. Yet other evidence supports a darker interpretation. The systematic elimination of witnesses, the meticulous staging of Edward's death scene, and the political advantage his death brought to Isabella and Mortimer all point to something more sinister than a natural death. The fact that similar execution methods were used in other medieval political assassinations lends credibility to these accounts, even if specific details may have been exaggerated over time. Perhaps the most compelling argument for the murder theory is the political logic of the situation. Isabella and Mortimer had chosen a path that made Edward's continued existence untenable. They had deposed an anointed king, seized power in the name of his minor son, and eliminated Edward's supporters through executions and exile. In such circumstances, leaving Edward alive was not just politically dangerous, it was suicidal. They had gone too far to turn back. The alleged method of execution, if it occurred, demonstrates a level of psychological sophistication that reflects medieval understandings of power, shame, and symbolic justice. It was not merely a killing, but a meticulously crafted statement about the consequences of defying societal norms. Edward's supposed homosexual relationships shocked his contemporaries, and his death was designed as a brutal punishment for these transgressions. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the blend of personal vengeance with political necessity. Isabella's motives were not solely political. She was personally humiliated by Edward's neglect and his blatant preference for his male favorites over his wife and queen. The alleged execution method suggests a degree of personal vindictiveness that transcends political calculation, reflecting the rage of a woman systematically ignored and demeaned by the man duty-bound to protect and honor her. The legacy of Edward II's death extends far beyond the immediate political fallout of 1327. This story, whether factual or legendary, became part of English folklore and political consciousness, serving as a cautionary tale about the risks of weak kingship and the consequences of violating social norms. It set precedents for deposing monarchs that resurfaced during later constitutional crises, particularly during the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I. The case also reveals the medieval interplay between sexuality, power, and political legitimacy themes that remain uncomfortable and relevant today. Edward's downfall was tied not only to his failures as a military leader or administrator, but to his inability to embody proper masculine authority and his apparent preference for relationships that defied societal expectations. His death, real or fabricated, was intended to punish not just political incompetence, but perceived sexual deviance. For modern readers, the story of Edward II's death raises complex questions about the nature of historical truth and how political propaganda can shape our understanding of the past. The accounts of his gruesome execution may be factual evidence of a monstrous crime or later fabrications designed to justify Edward III's actions and tarnish the reputation of Isabella and Mortimer. The truth may be forever lost in the labyrinth of medieval politics and propaganda. What remains indisputable is that Edward II's fate serves as a stark reminder of the cost of political failure in an era when power was personal, absolute, and unforgiving. Whether he died naturally, was killed conventionally, or suffered the gruesome execution described by chroniclers, his death marked the end of one of England's most tragic reigns and opened a new chapter in the long struggle between royal authority and noble resistance. The shadow cast by Edward II's death extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping English politics and royal conduct for generations. The very fact that a king could be not only deposed but potentially killed in such a brutal and symbolic manner fundamentally altered the relationship between ruler and ruled. Monarchs could no longer assume their divine appointment would shield them from the consequences of political missteps. A precedent was set. Even an anointed king could be executed if he alienated his subjects sufficiently. Edward III, inheriting the throne through his father's abdication and death, internalized these lessons. His reign became an era of military glory and administrative efficiency, marked by victories in France and Scotland that restored England's prestige and demonstrated the kind of martial kingship his father so conspicuously failed to provide. Consciously or not, Edward III's success was a systematic repudiation of everything his father represented, proving that the Plantagenet dynasty could produce effective rulers when guided by the harsh lessons of the past. The political innovations surrounding Edward II's deposition, particularly the involvement of Parliament in removing a king and the assertion that such actions could reflect the will of the entire kingdom, established constitutional precedents that echoed through English history. The idea that royal authority depended on effective governance rather than being an absolute divine right took root in England's political consciousness and ultimately contributed to the development of constitutional monarchy centuries later. Isabella herself, despite her initial success in eliminating Edward II, ultimately paid a high price for her role in his death. When Edward III came of age and asserted his authority, one of his first acts was to arrest and execute Roger Mortimer and place his mother in comfortable but permanent political exile. The official charges against Mortimer included the murder of Edward II, suggesting that even the new king believed his father had been killed rather than died naturally. The international ramifications of Edward's death were no less significant. Other European courts took note of how swiftly and completely a king could fall when he lost the support of his nobility and people. The ruthless efficiency of Edward II's elimination served as both an inspiration and a warning to other rulers facing internal opposition, demonstrating that in the medieval world, political failure could carry the most extreme personal consequences. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Edward II's death became embedded in England's cultural memory as a cautionary tale about the dangers of weak leadership and inappropriate personal relationships. Whether the gruesome details of his alleged murder were true or not, they served a powerful symbolic function, reinforcing societal norms around masculine authority, royal duty, and the consequences of defying established expectations. This story became part of the collective unconscious of English political culture, shaping attitudes toward power and leadership for centuries. The mystery surrounding the precise circumstances of Edward's death proved as politically useful as the death itself. The ambiguity allows each generation to interpret the story according to its own values and political needs, turning Edward II's fate into a kind of historical Rorschach test that reveals as much about those who tell the story as it does about the events themselves. Medieval chroniclers used it to justify Edward III's actions. Reformation-era writers leveraged it to critique papal interference in English affairs. Modern historians debate it as a matter of evidence and interpretation. What remains undisputed is that Edward II's death marked the end of one of the most tragic and instructive reigns in English history. His story reminds us that in the medieval world, personal and political failures could lead to consequences of unimaginable cruelty. Whether he died naturally, was killed conventionally, or suffered the horrific execution described by chroniclers, his end was the ultimate price of political inadequacy in an era when power was personal, absolute, and unforgiving. The final lesson from Edward II's death lies in the realization that the truth of past events may be less significant than the stories we tell about them. The accounts of his brutal murder, whether factual or fabricated, served critical political and social functions for those who spread them. They warned of the consequences of weak rule, reinforced norms about proper royal conduct, and provided justification for the actions of those who followed. In this sense, the story of Edward's death became more powerful than the death itself, shaping English political culture in ways that extended far beyond the walls of Berkeley Castle and the brief life of one failed king. Today, nearly 7 centuries after that September night in 1327, we still grapple with the questions raised by Edward II's fate. How far can political opposition go? What are the acceptable limits of resistance to authority? When does necessary change become unforgivable cruelty? These questions, as relevant today as they were in medieval England, ensure that the grim story of Edward II's death continues to resonate with modern audiences as both a historical lesson and an enduring warning about the nature of power, its exercise, and its terrifying consequences when it spirals out of control.